Hello, folks. I'm Shruti Appiah, and it's really nice to have you here on the Marlowe webinar. A little bit about myself. I am a product manager here at IOHK, especially for Marlowe. And, my background is that I am mainly an engineer, assistant design engineer in particular. And I really aim to bring economic sustainability to the entire space of decentralized finance and also just to the space of blockchain. So I've been working in the space of blockchain for over 5 years now. I've observed several trends that have been happening in this industry. I'm also very keen on improving the standards as well as the sustainability of economic protocols that have been built here in the system. So with that in mind, let's move on to talking about today's topic, which is the future of decentralized finance. So in this talk, we'll be discovering quite a few different things. First, I'll give an overview of the DeFi landscape today. This is the decentralized finance, is how we have developed it today. It's mainly marketplaces, so we'll look into that just to give a background and an understanding of all of the financial products that are available today. Next, we'll move on to talking about my thoughts around the future of DeFi. And here we'll be exploring 3 different aspects. The platform aspect, which explores everything about the different kinds of platforms that we'll need to build in order to make this a very usable product for real-life users, not just, people that are in the DeFi community today, but also, your Joe on the street. So that is something that we'll be exploring in platform. The second one is we're going to be exploring product, and here we're also going to be talking about the core infrastructure that's actually required to make these kinds of products sustainable as well as usable. And finally, finance and economics. Here you can see that we're really underpinning all of this in terms of user experience, and even in terms of economics, there is a user experience aspect, which is with regards to the costs that are associated with DeFi. As you know, that is actually one of the biggest problems that we have in the DeFi ecosystem today, is the very high cost. So we'll be exploring that as well. All right, let's move on to the DeFi landscape today. Here I'll be exploring some of the modules that we have in the decentralized financial ecosystem today that are not just within Cardano, but also in other ecosystems across many different kinds of blockchains. So let's see what are the critical modules that exist in DeFi in order for us to be able to develop as well as offer different kinds of financial instruments that can actually compete with the traditional finance industry. All right, the first one is decentralized exchanges. I'm sure you might have heard of this. These are called DEXs, and within that come automated market makers. So essentially, these are able to settle and also are able to determine the price of one asset with respect to another asset. And the most common kind of automated market maker that we have today, and also a very simple one, is the bonding curve. And a bonding curve is essentially a mathematical function that is able to determine the price of one asset or one token with respect to another kind of token. And within that, we also have a more complex financial instrument called a risk-adjusted bonding curve. This is essentially a bonding curve with a prediction market module that has been composed within it. And so this is actually one of the projects that I had built back in 2020. And these are especially useful in the field of social impact financing. And within these DEXs, the reason why we have these kinds of automated market makers is so that we can actually exchange tokens, we can actually exchange assets, right? And so with that regard, we have swaps. Swaps are enabled today mostly by markets, and those markets basically operate using these things called liquidity pools, which have pools of many different kinds of tokens that can be swapped in exchange for one another. So that's the scope of DEXs. The other one is also with regards to price discovery mechanisms. These are essentially ways in which we can determine the price of a particular asset or of a particular token depending upon what everybody values it. So one way to do it is using auctions. There are many kinds of auctions that we can use. We can use Vicky-Clarke Grove mechanisms, or we can use other different types of auctions as well as appraisals. Especially with the advent of NFTs, we're seeing that appraisals are also quite useful because we need to determine the price of a different type of NFT every time, right? So appraisals are also becoming quite useful. There's a renewed interest in it. Now let's talk about other modules that are also quite important. Now, one very useful and honestly, this is also something that also ties in very well to social impact is lending and credit. Now, this is eventually going to be our path to financial inclusion and our ability to bank the unbanked. Now, lending and credit is quite important. However, there are challenges in this particular module because of the fact that almost all these credit platforms today in the DeFi space are faced with the problem of over-collateralization. Now, that basically means that for every unit of credit that's given, there is a lot more collateral associated with it. Of course, if we have that kind of a problem, you can imagine that somebody that is not yet even banked may not be able to access this kind of credit. So this is a problem that we have to solve in the future of DeFi. The second one is with stablecoins, and these are essentially lenders or enablers for lending and credit because of the fact that in order for a given loan to be somewhat stable over time, because loans and these kinds of financial instruments always happen with that time element, right? So in order for that to be stable over time and for it to make financial sense and economic sense for the lender as well as the credit taker, stablecoins are a very, very useful component. And the other aspect with this as well is we can also have stablecoins that pertain to certain kinds of nations or central banks. And so that's also the advent of CBDCs, which is central bank digital currencies. The third one is oracles and prediction markets. Now, these are an absolute core requirement because even for the most simplest of contracts to operate and to be in line with the market, we need some sort of an oracle that we can get data from. So oracles are external data sources which have to be reliable, and they also have to be have high integrity when it comes to your data. So these are extremely important. And then there are prediction markets as well. Prediction markets are usually, they're enhancers. They're not core requirement, but they do enhance certain kinds of protocols really a lot. So this is one example that I also talked about earlier with the risk-adjusted bonding curves. Those are basically bonding curves with prediction market component associated with it. And that kind of combination or composability makes that an extremely powerful financial instrument in order to do any kinds of social impact financing, especially continuous funding models. All right. The third group of critical modules in DeFi are asset fractionalization is one of them. And this is especially becoming quite interesting these days because of the renewed interest with the rise of NFTs. So now NFTs exist, but NFTs may also be able to be fractionalized, and so that there is also a renewed interest in terms of fractionalization. The other one is with margin trading and leverage. Now these are more complex financial instruments that exist in the current financial system, but these might also be quite useful to more niche participants. The third one is balancing systems. Now, this is particularly important when it comes to systems that have multiple different subsystems. Now, when you have a proof-of-stake system and it also interoperates with, say, a DEX, right, then you're going to have liquidity pools and you're going to have validator sets of validators. Now, validators get validator rewards, liquidity providers get liquidity provider rewards. In order for both of these sets of people to coexist, those kinds of rewards need to be balanced with each other. Otherwise, people are going to move their entire activity to either being a validator or to being a liquidity provider, depending upon whichever rewards are greater, right? So in order for us to maintain that balance, in order to keep the system secure, and keep validators actually active, we need these kinds of balancing systems. And so, particularly in DEXs, you'll see this a lot. You don't want that kind of cannibalization of security or proof-of-stake security because of the fact that liquidity provider rewards might go very high. So, balancing systems are important, and they have been studied a little bit in different other ecosystems as well. Okay, now let's talk about the future of DeFi. This is our exploration for the future of decentralized finance, especially as it pertains to the user experience and how we can actually get user adoption of people that are not highly technical, that are not yet in this ecosystem, but they will be interested and they might actually find a very useful use case for operating with decentralized finance. So let's explore some of the products as well as some of the platform improvements that we need to bring to this ecosystem in order to make this usable and also financially sensible for everyday users. All right, the first aspect that we're going to discuss here is the platform. And within platform, we have three different prongs that we want to approach here. The first one is the area where we really see an advent for peer-to-peer solutions. Now, Marlowe is a good example of this one, where we're actually offering options for direct peer-to-peer finance, right? So with Marlowe, you're actually able to make contracts with your peers without having to go through a whole marketplace where you don't know who you're actually interacting with, but it's essentially just like interacting with like a market or a pool of, that has consolidated many different types of tokens and so on. So this is essentially the pure use case of smart contracts, automated contracting, being able to offer financial instruments in a more automated fashion and also in a much more direct fashion that you can actually go ahead and use. But for this to be successful, of course, the core requirement is that users need to be able to understand the smart contract. So we'll get to that later. The second one is consolidation. Now, we can see that in a lot of DeFi protocols today, as well as in the overall DeFi market, it's a very fragmented experience. Almost all of these products, they only specialize in offering one kind of service. There is one DeFi product that only offers lending. There's another DeFi product that might offer swaps, and it might also offer validator rewards and so on. But always it has been fairly fragmented so far. Whereas if you think about the real world, all of these kinds of solutions are offered by one or a handful of services, right? So for example, if I wanted to have any kind of, financial instruments, if I wanted to get a mortgage or if I wanted to buy a car, I would just have to go to my bank and they would take care of everything. So this is not possible yet in decentralized finance. So there needs to be some consolidation, not centralization, but a consolidation of the experience of using these multiple kinds of products. So there needs to be essentially one place or one single experience for meeting all of the different financial needs that a user might have. All right. And finally, we come down to user experience. Now, this is the very core. It's a pinnacle of, the path to user adoption as well as widespread and everyday user adoption. So for this to really make it a reality, we need to have consistent as well as easy to understand smart contracts. Now, not everybody can understand smart contracts. I was a smart contract developer at one point, but I can sure as well tell you that it is certainly not easy to read. It takes a while to actually interpret a contract and be able to make sense of it and understand the contractual obligations and so on and so forth. So the ability to understand smart contracts is really crucial. And this is also something that we do offer, or we plan to offer with Marlowe Run, which is that every step of the contract will be explained to the user so that the user understands what their obligations are, how much they're paying towards a contract, and all of the different aspects that are involved within a financial instrument. So this needs to be expanded beyond finance as well. Now, Marlowe is doing this for financial instruments, but of course, there are many different kinds of smart contracts. So all of that needs to be taken into account, made consistent as well across different kinds of platforms, so that there's no ambiguity. There's also the ease of understandability when people are switching over and so on. All right. The second one that needs to be built in order for user experience to really become a reality is tooling for mobile experiences, and that's because of the fact that most folks are going to be moving to mobile, or they have already switched over to mobile. And you can see that, with all of these contracts being even automated, that mobile is going to really become the next big thing, or it already is kind of already the big thing. And we can see this kind of trend also happening with challenger finance, where challenger finance banks such as Monzo, N26, and so on, because the user experience of all of the financial activities has become really simple, it's possible to do it on mobile, so why wouldn't anyone just do it on mobile? So that's also extremely important. And so all of the kinds of tooling, such as, light wallets that can interact with smart contracts on mobile, dApps that exist on mobile, as well as any kinds of notifications systems that need to notify the user whenever they have to fulfill a contractual obligation. All of those things need to be built in order for mobile experiences to become a reality. All right, and then finally, but also quite important, we have identity solutions. Now, identity solutions are extremely important because of the fact that the core of blockchain is public and private keys, and it's oftentimes really hard to remember your private key or store private keys. And also when it comes to sharing public keys, that becomes a very cumbersome solution, especially for a non-technical user, if they need to be sharing a really long string that doesn't make sense to them. So, things such as human readable addresses, those will become really big. And also identity solutions that pertain to, maintaining your identity. So things such as, if you were to forget your private key, how can you account for that? Is there some sort of social authentication system? And those kinds of solutions. All right, now the second aspect that we're going to talk about today is product. Now within product, we have many different aspects. Now the first one I want to talk about here is modularity and composability. Now, at the heart of all of this is that we are building all of these different solutions in an open source fashion. And because of that, modularity is also very important. Because with modularity, what we're able to do is we're able to build very basic and simple building blocks, which are essentially the most basic economic protocols that can be repurposed to build more hyper-exotic or more complex financial instruments. So what I'm proposing here is that the most simple and basic economic protocols need to be built in the base layer, and then following on from that, those can be composed in order to build more complex financial instruments. And so really following on from that is composability, where you have something very simple like a bonding curve and another simple aspect, or a very simple economic protocol like a prediction market. When you combine them together, then you can get a continuous funding mechanism that can be used for social impact projects. Now, these are essentially risk-adjusted bonding curves that we were also talking about earlier. And if you look them up, you can see several use cases for those. They've also been applied in projects in India and so on. All right. The other one is you have a very simple economic protocol such as liquidity pools that exist within DEXs that offer swapping capabilities. And then if you combine that with credit, the ability to borrow on leverage, as well as trade using that borrowed amount, then you're able to create margin trading capabilities. So those kinds of building blocks, being able to combine different kinds of simple instruments, financial instruments, to build even more complex and hyper-exotic financial instruments, those are really key when it comes to the development and the flourishing of the ecosystem. And the way that open source really ties into this is because of the fact that, of course, if everybody is going to be building all of these components, there's going to be a little bit of redundancy, right? So in order to avoid that, let's just build the most simple building blocks so that whenever somebody else comes into the ecosystem, they can basically use that in order to build more complex financial instruments. All right, the other one that we want to talk about here is interoperability. Now, this is something that we also talked in the previous session. With deep interoperability, right? The interoperability that we have today in the DeFi ecosystem mainly pertains to asset transfer across chains. And this is not even fully complete. There are some chains that aren't still able to talk to each other. But this is very much development underway. And the way that this has been accomplished is using bridges, as well as many different kinds of protocols that allow for these types of transfers. So asset transfer across chains, as well as cross-chain lending, And these kinds of solutions offer interoperability at the very, very high level layer, where it's basically just has to do with tokens and transfer of assets. Now, the kind of interoperability that I really foresee for the future of DeFi is deep interoperability. Now, with deep interoperability, we have things such as contracting across different chains, right? If you have a contract on one chain, will you be able to interpret that contract on another chain and have this kind of cross-chain smart contracts? This is what we would mean by deep interoperability, and I think it's absolutely crucial because most users are going to have assets across multiple different chains. Their activities are also going to be spread across multiple different chains. And personally, I view that the world isn't going to have like one dominant chain. It's going to be multiple chains which are all specialized in their own use cases. And those chains, as they interoperate, they will need to have a way in order for contracting to be possible across these chains. So that's what we mean by deep interoperability. And another way to also approach this is to have financial contract standardization, or standardization of actually any kinds of smart contracts. The first one that we're actually looking at here is financial contracts, because financial contracts can actually be broken down, can be simplified in order for standardization to actually take place. So this is something that we're exploring with Marlowe and Actis. As you know, Actis is an algorithmic financial standards body, and so they have already categorized multiple different kinds of financial smart contracts and instruments in order to simplify them and establish those kinds of standards. So what we're doing here is also seeing if it's possible to apply that to financial smart contracts. All right. So the final one that I want to talk about in terms of product here is scalability and optimization. Now, with scalability and optimization, you guys are able to understand that this is one of the core products that we have in the entire blockchain space today, especially as these chains are unable to handle the network congestion that's coming their way. So in order to make blockchain systems scalable, what we're proposing here is that we minimize the amount of on-chain data and computations that need to be made on the blockchain directly, right? So this is essentially a new system architecture paradigm. And so within this, we'll have a true state as well as a synthetic state. A true state is essentially the state that exists on-chain, and it's comprised of all of the state variables, where each state variable is computed as well as updated on-chain with every single state change or block. So you can see that the update frequency is with every block, so it's very frequent. And it also gets stored on-chain, right? And what is happening today is most of the dApps are built in this way that all of these computations actually happen on-chain, as well as all of the data gets stored on-chain, and very little actually happens off-chain. So what we're proposing is that we maximize that synthetic state, right? With synthetic state, a large amount of state variables can actually be deterministically computed from a set of the latest true state variables that are pulled from the blockchain. So you have that true state that is already existing. It's true. That means it's accepted by all of the participants. It is the most validated state history. Now, in the synthetic state, what you're able to do is you're able to have even more state variables, so you can maintain your system. But all of these are just computed off-chain, as well as the logic for these computations are also housed off-chain. So that way, you don't have to store any of this data off-chain. It only needs to be pulled whenever it's required. And this improves performance, and it also improves cost, because you're able to save the on-chain computational as well as storage costs. So by maximizing synthetic state and true state ratio, this is able to be achieved for all kinds of dApps. The second one that I also want to touch on here very quickly is time locks for contractual obligations. So this is something that we have in Marlowe, and we're able to do this as well. It's one way in which we're also able to offer more security for the smart contracts. But time locks really help, because that way, if the contractual obligation is not met by the user within a given time, then that kind of contract might fail. And finally, we're going to talk about economics and the financial aspects of how decentralized finance might be very useful to the end user, to the everyday user. Now, the two core things about economic aspects here are problems that end users have around stability. So this involves things such as the core functions of money. So earlier we touched on the core functions of money, which is that money needs to be a unit of account, as well as a store of value, as well as a medium of exchange. And if all of those three functions are decently met, then money is essentially fulfilling its role, right? However, what we are seeing with a lot of cryptocurrencies especially is that they're highly volatile, so they are not exactly satisfying that requirement of being mediums of exchange. If they're highly volatile, then there's no notion of a stable price for a particular asset. So you can imagine that since one of these core functions of money is not satisfied by the cryptocurrency, that these haven't been very useful in a ton of use cases that we are able to execute in traditional finance today. So in order to account for that, we have things such as stablecoins. And now stablecoins are quite useful when it comes to offering things such as lending and credit as well, because over time we can have that kind of stability or that kind of guarantee that if you are going to be borrowing in this amount of coins, then you will be able to repay some interest on that same amount instead of those kinds of baseline currency prices varying too hard. So stability is also very important when it comes to making economic sense for these products to exist within the decentralized finance market. The second one that we want to talk about here is cost. Now, as you know, that as more people are onboarding the blockchain and more of the network is being congested, costs are becoming quite high because of the fact that more and more people want to be sending their transactions at higher speeds. So, performance deteriorates and costs also become really high. That's one aspect. The second aspect about cost is that costs also vary very heavily over time. And that's because of the different levels of congestions that happen over different points of time. But it's also because of the fact that the underlying change in the price of the token itself, right? So these two have many kinds of, or introduce many kinds of uncertainties when it comes to contracting anything on chain. So in order to account for both of these problems, what we're proposing here is insurance services. Now, insurance services will be able to offer sort of guarantees that, if a transaction exceeds this amount of cost, then the insurance service might come in and cover the excess amount and so on. So this is also an idea, the incipient idea that we're exploring with Marlowe, because we really want to make Marlowe be useful for the everyday user. And for the everyday user, we understand that all of these different aspects that we talk about in terms of economics, as well as in terms of product, as well as platform, those user experience aspects need to be met in order for it to make economical sense, as well as them being able to understand more technical language when it comes to contracting and so on. So insurance services is something that will be quite useful in the future, and we're looking forward to seeing how we can build it. All right, with that, we have explored the three different aspects of the future of decentralized finance. I hope you folks found it useful, and I'll be doing a Q&A session today with joining Simon and Maki as well. If you have any questions with regards to the future of decentralized finance and our approach to how we're solving some of these problems, then please feel to ask it. I've shared here my LinkedIn as well as my GitHub if you want to reach me, and we'll move on to the Q&A session shortly. Cheers, folks.